Sarah Mitchell thought she knew everything about her father. For 38 years, he was just Dad, a quiet man who drove a 15-year-old Honda and clipped coupons at the grocery store. But 3 days after his funeral, when the lawyers called her into that mahogany-paneled office, everything she thought she knew shattered. Her father wasn't just comfortable, he was worth $847 million, and the moment that news leaked, the two people she trusted most in this world would orchestrate the cruelest betrayal imaginable. This is a story about secrets buried so deep that even a daughter never suspected the truth. It's about a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was rotting from within. And it's about a friendship that was never real, just a long, calculated game of manipulation that would end in a courtroom revelation so shocking it would make headlines across the country. Over the next hour, you're going to hear about deceit that spans years, evidence hidden in plain sight, and a father's final act of protection that would expose everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Mitchell was 38 years old when her world changed forever, but to understand how completely her life would be turned upside down, you need to understand who she was before that phone call from the lawyer's office. Sarah lived in Fairfield, Connecticut, in a modest 3-bedroom colonial house with white shutters and a maple tree in the front yard that turned brilliant red every October. She'd lived there for 8 years with her husband David, and from the outside, their life looked like the American dream distilled into its most comfortable form. Sarah worked as a marketing manager for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, the kind of job that paid well enough for vacations to the Cape once a year and a reliable contribution to a retirement account. David was a financial advisor at a local firm, and together they made enough to live comfortably without ever feeling wealthy. They had no children, not because they couldn't, but because they'd always said they were waiting for the right time, though that right time never seemed to arrive, and eventually they'd stop talking about it altogether. Sarah's best friend since college was Jessica Chen, a woman she'd met during freshman orientation at the University of Connecticut 20 years earlier. Jessica lived just 3 streets away in a similar house with her boyfriend Marcus, and the 4 of them, Sarah, David, Jessica, and Marcus, had fallen into an easy rhythm of dinners every Thursday night, alternating houses, alternating who cooked. They'd vacation together sometimes, renting a beach house in Maine or taking a long weekend in the Berkshires. Sarah considered Jessica the sister she'd never had, the person she called first with good news or bad, the one who knew her coffee order without asking and could tell when she was upset just by the tone of her text messages. This was Sarah's life for 12 years of marriage, and by all accounts she was happy with its predictability and its warmth. But there was one person who existed slightly outside this comfortable circle, someone Sarah loved deeply but never quite understood: her father, Robert Mitchell. Robert was 71 years old when he died on February 14, 2023, and he'd been a presence in Sarah's life that was both constant and somehow distant at the same time. He lived 45 minutes away in a small ranch house in Stratford that he'd bought in 1989 and never left. The house had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a basement that smelled like motor oil and old newspapers. Robert had worked as an aerospace engineer for 37 years before retiring at 65, and Sarah had always assumed he lived on a modest pension and Social Security. He drove the same Honda Accord for 18 years, replacing it only when the transmission finally gave out, and even then he'd bought another Honda Accord, just a few years newer and not much more expensive. Robert would come to dinner once a month, always on the first Sunday, and he'd bring a bottle of wine that never cost more than $15 and a container of his homemade marinara sauce that Sarah loved. He'd ask about her work, listen to David talk about the stock market, and then he'd help with the dishes before driving home by 8:30 because he didn't like driving in the dark anymore. Sarah would call him every Wednesday evening and they'd talk for exactly 20 minutes about nothing particularly important: the weather, a book he was reading, a problem with his gutters. He never asked her for money, never complained about his modest lifestyle, and never once gave her any indication that his life was anything other than what it appeared to be. He was just Dad, reliable and quiet and always there when she needed him, which wasn't often because Sarah had built a life that didn't require much help from anyone. Looking back, Sarah would remember small moments that should have been clues, tiny fractures in the story her father had constructed so carefully. There was the time when she was 25 and her car had broken down, needing a $2,000 repair she couldn't afford on her entry-level salary. Her father had called her the next day and told her the money had been transferred to her account, and when she'd protested that it was too much, he'd said simply that he'd been saving for emergencies and this was what emergencies were for. She'd never questioned where a retired engineer living in a tiny ranch house got $2,000 to give away without hesitation. There was the time her father had mentioned, almost casually over dinner, that money changes people and it shows you who they really are. Sarah had thought he was just being philosophical, maybe thinking about a colleague from his engineering days, but the way he'd looked at her when he said it, there was something more there, something she'd been too comfortable to examine, and then there was something else, something Sarah wouldn't remember clearly until much later when she was sitting in a lawyer's office trying to piece together how she'd missed all the signs. 6 months before her father died, on a Saturday afternoon in August, Sarah had stopped by Jessica's house to drop off a book she'd borrowed. She'd texted that she was coming, but Jessica hadn't responded, which wasn't unusual because Jessica often left her phone in another room. Sarah had let herself in through the side door. They had that kind of friendship where keys were exchanged and boundaries were blurred, and she'd found David and Jessica sitting at the kitchen table with coffee mugs in front of them. They'd looked up when she walked in, and there had been just a fraction of a second, maybe less than a second, where both of their faces had registered something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Surprise, yes, but something else underneath it. Then David had smiled and said they were planning her surprise birthday party, which was still 3 months away, and Jessica had laughed and said they were terrible at keeping secrets, and now the surprise was ruined. Sarah had laughed too and told them she'd forget she saw anything, and then they'd all had coffee together and talked about where they should go for dinner that weekend. Sarah never thought about that moment again until everything fell apart, but when she did think about it later, she would realize that David and Jessica hadn't had any papers in front of them, no party planning notes or catering menus or lists of people to invite. They'd just been sitting there with coffee, talking in low voices, and they'd stopped the moment she walked in. But at the time, Sarah had simply filed it away as a sweet gesture by two people who loved her, because that's what you do when you trust someone completely. You interpret everything they do through the lens of that trust, and you miss all the evidence that the trust is misplaced. Robert Mitchell died suddenly on a Tuesday morning. He'd been at the grocery store, reaching for a can of tomatoes on the top shelf when he'd grabbed his chest and collapsed. The manager called 911 and they'd worked on him for 20 minutes right there in aisle 7, but the heart attack was massive and by the time they got him to the hospital, he was gone. Sarah got the call at work from a nurse who asked if she was Robert Mitchell's next of kin, and when Sarah said yes, the nurse's voice had gotten softer and she'd said that Sarah needed to come to the hospital right away. Sarah had known in that moment, before the nurse even said the words, that her father was dead. You know these things somehow, the way the air changes when someone tells you something that will divide your life into before and after. David had been incredible in those first few days. He'd taken time off work immediately, made all the phone calls Sarah couldn't bring herself to make, arranged for the funeral home to pick up her father's body, contacted the church where Robert had attended services occasionally but not regularly. Jessica had been there too, showing up at Sarah's house with groceries and tissues and quiet company. She'd screened phone calls from distant relatives Sarah barely knew who were suddenly concerned, and she'd helped Sarah pick out the casket and the flowers and the songs for the service. The funeral was small because Robert hadn't been a man with many friends, just some former colleagues from the aerospace company and a few neighbors from his street who'd known him for decades. Sarah had stood at the front of the church and delivered a eulogy about a man she'd loved but never fully understood, and she'd cried and felt David's hand on her shoulder and Jessica's hand holding hers, and she'd thought about how grateful she was to have people who loved her during the hardest moment of her life. 3 days after the funeral, Sarah had been sitting at home sorting through sympathy cards when her phone rang. The caller ID said Pemberton and Associates, which meant nothing to her. She'd answered, and a man's voice had introduced himself as Harold Pemberton, attorney at law, and he'd said he needed to meet with her regarding her father's estate. Sarah had assumed this was about the house in Stratford and maybe a small savings account, so she'd asked if they could handle things over the phone because she wasn't ready to drive out to wherever his office was. Harold had been quiet for a moment, and then he'd said, in a voice that was both gentle and firm, that this really needed to be handled in person and could she come to his office in Hartford the next day. There was something in his tone that made Sarah agree, and the next morning she'd put on black pants and a sweater and driven 40 minutes to an office building in downtown Hartford that looked too expensive for her father to have had any business with. Harold Pemberton's office was on the 14th floor with windows that looked out over the Connecticut River. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah's mortgage payment, and when he shook her hand, his grip was firm and his eyes were kind. He'd offered her coffee, which she'd declined, and then he'd asked her to sit down in a leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. Sarah had sat and folded her hands in her lap and waited for him to tell her about her father's house and his savings account and whatever small inheritance she'd be receiving. Harold had opened a leather portfolio in front of him, and then he'd looked at her directly and said something Sarah would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the months that followed. "Miss Mitchell, your father was an extraordinarily private man, and what I'm about to tell you will come as a shock." Harold had paused then, as if giving her time to brace herself, and then he'd continued. "Your father's estate is valued at approximately $847 million, and you are the sole beneficiary." Sarah had heard the words, but they hadn't made sense, the way sometimes you hear a sentence in a foreign language and your brain tries to rearrange the sounds into something familiar. She'd actually laughed, a short, nervous sound, and said there must be some mistake. Her father lived in a tiny house and drove an old Honda and shopped with coupons. Harold had nodded and said yes, he did all of those things, and he did them while being worth nearly $1 billion. Then he'd slid a document across the desk, and Sarah had looked down at numbers that didn't seem real, columns and accounts and investment portfolios that went on for pages. Harold had explained it methodically, the way someone might explain a complex machine to a person who'd never seen anything mechanical before. Robert Mitchell had been one of the early investors in 3 technology companies in the 1990s, companies that Sarah had heard of but never connected to her father. He'd bought stock when these companies were startups operating out of garages, and he'd held on to that stock when everyone said it would crash, and by 2000, those investments were worth hundreds of millions. He'd also held 17 patents on aerospace components, specialized parts that went into commercial aircraft and defense systems, and these patents had generated royalty payments for 30 years. The royalties alone amounted to millions annually. Robert had taken all of this money and given it to a private wealth management firm in Manhattan who'd invested it carefully and conservatively, growing it steadily year after year while Robert lived on his modest pension and drove his old Honda and clipped his coupons at the grocery store. Sarah had sat in that leather chair trying to process information that seemed to violate everything she understood about her father and about reality itself. She'd asked Harold why would her father live like that when he had so much, and Harold had pulled out an envelope with Sarah's name written on it in her father's handwriting. He'd handed it to her and told her to read it, and Sarah had opened it with shaking hands. The letter inside was 2 pages long, and it started with the words, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and I need you to understand why I lived the way I did." Her father's handwriting was shaky but clear, and Sarah read through tears as he explained that wealth changes people, that he'd seen it happen to colleagues and friends, how money revealed character rather than building it. He'd wanted Sarah to grow up knowing who she was without money defining her, wanted her to make her own way and her own choices without the weight of a fortune shaping every decision. The letter went on. "I've watched you build a good life, Sarah, a life based on your own efforts and your own values, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become. This money is yours now, and I trust you to use it wisely, but please remember that wealth is a tool, nothing more and nothing less. It can protect you, but it can also attract people who don't have your best interests at heart. Be careful who you trust. Guard your heart. And know that I loved you more than any amount of money could ever express. Sarah had finished reading and looked up at Harold through blurred vision, and she'd asked him what she was supposed to do now. Harold had told her that there would be time to figure all of that out, that his firm would help her navigate the legal and financial complexities, but for now she should just go home and process what she'd learned. Sarah had nodded and stood up and shaken his hand, and then she'd walked out of that office building into the cold February afternoon feeling like she'd woken up in someone else's life. She'd sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive. Her father had been worth $847 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, like Monopoly money or a lottery jackpot that happens to other people. She thought about all the times she'd worried about him in that little house, wondered if he had enough money for repairs or medical bills or a comfortable retirement. She thought about the years he'd worked at that aerospace company, the brown bag lunches he'd brought because the cafeteria was too expensive, the way he'd worn his clothes until they were threadbare before buying new ones. All of it had been a choice, a deliberate construction of a modest life built on top of a fortune he never touched. Sarah had driven home in a daze, and when she'd walked through her front door, David had been there waiting, and she'd told him everything. She'd watched his face as she explained about the lawyer and the letter and the $847 million, and she'd seen his expression shift from disbelief to shock to something else, something that at the time Sarah had interpreted as excitement for her, happiness that she'd been given this incredible gift from her father. David had hugged her and said this was amazing, that her father had been protecting her all along, that this changed everything in the best possible way. He'd opened a bottle of wine even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, and they'd sat at the kitchen table talking about what this meant. David had started asking questions almost immediately. How was the money structured? Was it in trusts or accounts? What kind of taxes would she owe? Could they access it right away? Sarah had felt overwhelmed by the questions and said she didn't know the answers yet, that Harold was going to walk her through everything over the next few weeks. David had nodded and said of course they didn't need to figure it all out today, but his eyes had been bright with something that Sarah couldn't quite name. When Jessica had called that evening to check on Sarah, David had answered the phone and told her the news, and Sarah had heard Jessica's voice rise in surprise and excitement on the other end of the line. Jessica had come over within the hour, and the three of them had sat together talking late into the night about Robert's secret life and what Sarah would do with the inheritance. What happened next would take weeks to unfold, but it started with small things that Sarah noticed but didn't recognize as warnings. David had always been involved in their finances. He was a financial advisor after all, so it made sense that he handled their investments and retirement accounts. But now he became intensely focused on Sarah's inheritance, asking her repeatedly about meetings with Harold, wanting to know details about account structures and liquidity and tax strategies. He'd suggested that Sarah should move quickly to consolidate the assets, that having money spread across multiple accounts and investment vehicles was inefficient. When Sarah said Harold had advised her to take her time and not make any major decisions immediately, David had gotten frustrated and said Harold was being overly cautious, that they were losing money every day by not optimizing the portfolio. Sarah had pushed back gently, saying she trusted Harold and wanted to follow his advice, and David had dropped the subject, but she'd seen his jaw tighten with what looked like anger. Jessica had been different too, though in more subtle ways. She'd started asking questions about the inheritance that seemed overly detailed for a casual conversation, what percentage was in stocks versus bonds, whether the money was in Sarah's name alone or if it would be considered marital property, whether Robert had set up any trusts or foundations that would limit Sarah's access to the funds. At the time, Sarah had thought Jessica was just being a concerned friend, trying to help her understand the complexity of what she'd inherited. Jessica worked in real estate, so she dealt with financial matters regularly, and it made sense that she'd be curious about the structure of such a large estate. But there was something in the way Jessica asked the questions, a kind of precision and persistence that should have triggered alarm bells if Sarah had been paying closer attention. She wasn't paying close attention, though, because she was grieving her father and trying to process the revelation that her entire understanding of his life had been built on a foundation of secrets, and she didn't have the emotional energy to analyze her husband's intensity or her best friend's curiosity. The news leaked 2 weeks after Sarah's meeting with Harold. Someone at the law firm, a paralegal who would later be fired for breach of confidentiality, mentioned the Mitchell estate to someone at their gym, and that person told someone else, and within 72 hours the story was everywhere. The local newspaper ran a headline that said secret billionaire lived among us and included a photo of Robert's modest ranch house. The article detailed how an aerospace engineer had quietly amassed a fortune while living like an average middle-class retiree, and it named Sarah as the sole heir. By the next day, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and then national ones. Sarah's phone started ringing constantly with calls from reporters and from financial advisors offering their services and from distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years who suddenly wanted to reconnect. She stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize, but the voicemails kept piling up. David's reaction to the publicity was immediate and intense. He'd been angry that the story had leaked, saying it put a target on Sarah's back, that now everyone would know she was wealthy and they'd all want something from her. He'd been right about that. The requests started coming in almost immediately. Former classmates reached out asking for loans to start businesses. Charities she'd never heard of sent letters requesting donations. A second cousin she'd met exactly once at a funeral 15 years ago called to say he was struggling financially and could she help him out. Sarah had felt overwhelmed by it all, and David had appointed himself as her protector, screening her calls and emails, telling people no on her behalf. At the time, Sarah had been grateful for his help, relieved that someone was creating a buffer between her and the onslaught of attention and requests. She didn't recognize that David was also creating a buffer between her and everyone else, isolating her in a way that would make what came next easier for him. 3 weeks after the news leaked, Sarah had a meeting with Harold and his team of financial advisors and tax attorneys. They'd spent 4 hours going over the details of the estate, explaining how the various accounts worked, what her tax obligations would be, and what her options were for managing the money going forward. Harold had recommended that Sarah take at least 6 months before making any major decisions, that she should let herself grieve her father properly and adjust to this new reality before restructuring her entire financial life. The team had also recommended that Sarah not commingle the inheritance with her marital assets, that she should keep it in separate accounts in her name only to protect it legally. When Sarah had come home and told David about this recommendation, his reaction had been swift and cold. He'd said that keeping the money separate implied she didn't trust him, that married couples were supposed to share everything, that by protecting the inheritance she was essentially saying she thought their marriage might not last. Sarah had been taken aback by the intensity of his response. She'd tried to explain that it was just standard legal advice, that Harold was simply being cautious and looking out for her best interests, but David had turned it into an argument about trust and commitment. He'd said that if she really loved him, if she really believed in their marriage, she'd put his name on the accounts too. Sarah had felt confused and guilty, wondering if maybe David was right, maybe she was being paranoid and suspicious for no reason. But something in her father's letter kept echoing in her mind. Be careful who you trust, guard your heart, and she'd told David that she wanted to follow Harold's advice for now, that it wasn't about trust but about being smart and cautious. David had gotten quiet after that, a cold silence that lasted for 2 days, and when he finally started speaking to her again normally, there was something different in the way he looked at her, something that made Sarah feel like she was being evaluated rather than loved. It was during this same period that Sarah started noticing Jessica's behavior becoming stranger. Jessica had always been the kind of friend who texted multiple times a day, who wanted to know what Sarah was doing for lunch or if she wanted to meet for coffee or go shopping on the weekend. But now the texts had an edge to them, questions wrapped in casual conversation. Hey, have you moved any of the money around yet, or is it still in those accounts Harold set up? Just curious how these things work with estates that size. Sarah would respond briefly, feeling vaguely uncomfortable but not sure why. One afternoon, Jessica had suggested they go to the courthouse together because Jessica needed to file some real estate paperwork and they could grab lunch after. They'd gone, and while Jessica was at the clerk's office, Sarah had waited in the lobby scrolling through her phone. What Sarah didn't know was that Jessica had actually been in the records office pulling documents related to Sarah and David's marriage license and property records, doing research that had nothing to do with real estate transactions and everything to do with understanding exactly what legal claims David might have to Sarah's inheritance. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon in March, exactly 4 weeks after Sarah had learned about her father's fortune. Sarah had taken the afternoon off work to meet with Harold again, this time to discuss setting up a charitable foundation in her father's name. The meeting had gone well, and she'd left Harold's office feeling purposeful and excited about doing something meaningful with the money. She'd gotten home around 2:30, much earlier than her usual 6 o'clock arrival, and she'd pulled into the driveway to see Jessica's car parked on the street. That wasn't unusual. Jessica had a key to Sarah's house and would sometimes stop by during the day if she was in the neighborhood. What was unusual was that David's car was also in the garage, because David should have been at work until at least 5. Sarah had walked in through the front door and called out hello, but nobody had answered. She'd set her purse down on the kitchen counter and noticed 2 coffee mugs in the sink, both still warm. She'd felt a prickle of unease but told herself it was nothing, that there was surely a reasonable explanation for why David and Jessica were here in the middle of the afternoon. She'd walked through the living room and heard voices coming from upstairs, from the direction of the master bedroom. Sarah had climbed the stairs quietly, not intentionally trying to be stealthy, but moving slowly because something in her gut was telling her to be careful, to pay attention, to see before being seen. She'd reached the top of the stairs and moved down the hallway toward her bedroom, and as she got closer, she could hear the voices more clearly. David's voice, low and urgent. Jessica's voice, sharp and focused. Sarah had stopped outside the bedroom door, which was open about 6 inches, and she'd looked through the gap. What she saw would replay in her mind in slow motion for months afterward, every detail etched with perfect clarity. David and Jessica were standing on opposite sides of Sarah's bed, and spread across the bedspread were papers, financial documents that Sarah recognized immediately because she'd left them in her home office 2 days earlier. Bank statements from Harold's firm, investment portfolios, tax documents, account numbers, and balances. David and Jessica were photographing these documents with their phones, David taking pictures of the statements while Jessica photographed the investment reports. They were moving quickly and efficiently, like people who'd done this before, like people who had a system. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, watching through the crack in the door, her brain trying to process what her eyes were seeing and her heart already knowing the truth, even though her mind was rejecting it. Then she heard Jessica say something that would echo in her memory forever. If she puts it in a trust, you'll get nothing in the divorce. You need to move fast. Get her to commingle the assets while she's still emotional and confused. Once it's mixed with marital property, your claim gets stronger. Sarah's entire body went cold. She'd heard the words, but they seemed to be coming from very far away, like listening to a conversation through water. Divorce, your claim. The words didn't make sense in the context of the marriage she thought she had, the friendship she thought she had. David had responded, but Sarah couldn't hear what he said because there was a ringing in her ears, a high-pitched tone that seemed to be coming from inside her own head. She'd stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 seconds. And then she'd pushed the door open fully and said in a voice that sounded surprisingly calm, "What is happening right now?" David and Jessica had both spun around, their faces registering shock that would have been almost comical if Sarah hadn't been falling apart inside. David's phone was still in his hand, pointed at a bank statement. Jessica's hand was frozen over a stack of investment reports. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved or spoke, and Sarah could see them both thinking frantically, trying to figure out what to say, how to explain what she was seeing. Then David had lowered his phone and smiled, actually smiled, and said it wasn't what it looked like. They were trying to help her organize these documents, trying to understand them so they could explain them to her better. Jessica had nodded quickly and said, "Yeah, these financial documents are so complicated, and they just wanted to make sense of them for her." Sarah had looked at both of them and said very quietly, "I heard what you said about the divorce and the trust." The room had gone completely silent. Jessica's face had lost its color. David's smile had disappeared. Sarah had walked into the bedroom and looked down at all her private financial information spread across her bed like evidence at a crime scene, and she'd said again, louder this time, "I heard you." David had tried one more time to deflect, saying she'd misheard, she was upset and emotional, and grief could make you paranoid. She was misinterpreting an innocent conversation. But Sarah had turned to face him, and there must have been something in her face, some terrible clarity. Shaw, because David had stopped talking and his expression had changed. The mask had slipped just for a moment, and Sarah had seen underneath it, had seen something cold and calculating that she'd never noticed before, or maybe had never been there before, or maybe had always been there and she'd just never looked closely enough. "How long?" Sarah had asked. She'd directed the question at David, but her eyes had moved to Jessica too, because somehow she already knew that whatever was happening involved both of them. "How long what?" David had said, still trying to play innocent. "How long have you been planning to divorce me? How long have you two been doing whatever this is?" The silence that followed was terrible, heavy with the weight of a truth that was about to surface and destroy everything. Sarah had seen David and Jessica exchange a glance, some kind of wordless communication between them, and that glance had told her everything she needed to know even before either of them spoke. "Oh God," Sarah had said, and she'd sat down on the edge of the bed because her legs didn't seem capable of supporting her weight anymore. "Oh God, how long have you two been together?" What happened next came out in fragments, accusations and denials, and finally admissions that fell like bombs. David had tried to maintain the pretense for about 2 more minutes, but Sarah hadn't let him. She demanded the truth with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, and eventually, piece by piece, the truth had emerged. David and Jessica had been having an affair for 2 years. 2 years of Thursday night dinners where they'd sat across the table from Sarah and lied with their faces and their voices and their actions. 2 years of Jessica being Sarah's best friend while sleeping with her husband. 2 years of David coming home and kissing Sarah hello while smelling like Jessica's perfume. Sarah had listened to this and felt something inside her break, something fundamental and irreparable. But it got worse. It got so much worse. Because as the truth spilled out, Sarah learned that the affair wasn't just about attraction or love or any of the reasons people usually betray their spouses. David and Jessica had been planning this. They'd been waiting. David had wanted to leave Sarah for over a year, but they'd calculated that it made more financial sense to wait until Sarah's father died, because David assumed there would be some modest inheritance that he could claim part of in a divorce. Jessica had agreed to wait because she wanted David and she was willing to play the long game. Neither of them had known about Robert's actual fortune. That revelation had come as much of a shock to them as it had to Sarah. But when they'd found out, everything had changed. Suddenly, there wasn't a modest inheritance to split in a divorce. There were hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. Sarah had sat on the bed listening to this and trying to understand how the two people she trusted most had been capable of such calculation, such patience in their cruelty. She'd asked David when he'd stopped loving her, if he'd ever loved her at all. David hadn't answered that question. Instead, he'd said something worse. He'd said, "Does it really matter anymore?" Then he'd told her that he was filing for divorce, that he'd already retained a lawyer 3 days ago, and that he was entitled to half of marital assets under Connecticut law. Sarah had felt like she was watching this scene happen to someone else. She'd heard herself ask what marital assets he thought he was entitled to, and David had looked at her with an expression that was part pity and part contempt, and said he was entitled to half of everything, including the inheritance. That's when Harold's words from weeks earlier had come back to her with perfect clarity. "Don't commingle the assets. keep everything in separate accounts. She'd followed that advice despite David's anger, despite his arguments about trust, and now she understood why Harold had been so insistent. Connecticut was an equitable distribution state, which meant that marital assets were divided fairly in a divorce, though not always equally. But inheritances were typically considered separate property if they were kept separate. David's lawyer would argue that the inheritance should be divided because of the length of the marriage, because of David's contributions to the household, because of a dozen different legal theories. But because Sarah had kept everything in her name only, in accounts that were clearly separate from their joint accounts, she had a much stronger position. She'd looked at David and said he wasn't getting a penny of her father's money, and David had laughed, actually laughed, and said they'd see what a judge decided. Then Sarah had turned to Jessica, who'd been standing silent through this entire exchange. "What about you?" Sarah had said. "What do you get out of this?" Jessica had met her eyes, and for a moment Sarah had thought she might apologize, might show some remorse or recognition of how deeply she'd betrayed their friendship. Instead, Jessica had said something that would haunt Sarah for months. "You really thought I liked hanging around you all those years? Listening to your boring stories about work? You were so easy to manipulate, Sarah. So trusting, so pathetically grateful to have a friend." Sarah had felt those words like physical blows. Jessica had continued, her voice getting sharper with each sentence. "David and I were going to be together regardless of your father's money. We'd already planned it. We were going to wait until your birthday next month, and then he was going to tell you he wanted a divorce. But then your father died and everything changed. Do you understand how much money you're sitting on? David deserves half of that. He put up with you for 12 years. "Put up with me," Sarah had repeated, and she'd started laughing, a high hysterical sound that didn't sound like her own voice. "Put up with me in the marriage you sabotaged, the friendship you faked. Everything was a lie." Jessica had shrugged and said not everything. They'd had some good times too, but yes, the friendship was never real, not in the way Sarah thought it was. Jessica had been working with David from the beginning, from before the affair even started. David had told her about his plan to eventually leave Sarah, and Jessica had volunteered to get close to her, to become her best friend, to be positioned as a support system for when the divorce happened. That way, David wouldn't look like the bad guy who abandoned his wife with no support system. But once the affair started, Jessica's role had changed. She'd become David's spy, reporting back on Sarah's emotional state, her plans, her conversations with her father. All of that information about Robert's warnings, about his concerns regarding money and character, Jessica had fed all of that back to David, and they'd been careful to never let their true feelings show. Sarah had stood up from the bed feeling dizzy, feeling like the room was tilting around her. She'd told them both to get out of her house. David had said it was his house, too. His name was on the deed, and he wasn't going anywhere. Sarah had called the police. They'd arrived 20 minutes later and explained that since both David and Sarah owned the house, neither could force the other to leave without a court order. The officers had suggested that one of them stay somewhere else for the night to let things cool down, and David had smirked and said he'd be happy to stay at Jessica's place. He'd packed a bag right there in front of Sarah and the police officers, taking his time, making a show of it, and then he'd walked out with Jessica following behind him. Neither of them had looked back at Sarah standing in the doorway. She'd watched them get into Jessica's car together, David in the passenger seat where Sarah had sat hundreds of times, and she'd watched them drive away. Then she'd gone inside and locked the door and slid down to the floor with her back against it and cried harder than she'd cried even at her father's funeral. The next morning, Sarah had called Harold and told him everything. Harold had listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said something that made Sarah sit up straight. "Miss Mitchell, I need you to come to my office immediately. There's something your father left for you. Something I was instructed to give you only if certain circumstances occurred. I think your father knew this might happen." Sarah had driven to Hartford in a daze. So when she'd arrived at Harold's office, he'd been waiting for her with a manila envelope in his hands. The envelope was thick and sealed with wax, and across the front in Robert's handwriting it said, "To be opened only if Sarah faces betrayal." Harold had handed it to her and left the room to give her privacy. Sarah had broken the wax seal with shaking hands and pulled out the contents. There was a letter, several pages long, and a thick folder of documents. She'd started with the letter. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. The people you trusted have betrayed you, and you're probably feeling alone and devastated and wondering how you missed the signs. I need you to know something. You didn't miss the signs. They were careful, they were patient, they were skilled liars. This is not your fault." As Sarah had read those words through tears, her father's voice clear in her mind. The letter continued, "I didn't hide my wealth from you to be cruel. I hid it to protect you and to see who truly loved you for who you are. I've been watching David for the past 2 years. I've been watching Jessica too. And I've seen things that troubled me deeply, things I couldn't prove but couldn't ignore." Robert's letter explained that 18 months before his death, he'd noticed changes in David's behavior, small things at first. David asking too many questions about Robert's finances. David making comments about inheritance and estate planning that seemed too pointed, too calculated. Robert had started paying closer attention, and he'd noticed the way David and Jessica looked at each other when they thought nobody was watching. He'd noticed Jessica asking Sarah probing questions about Robert's health, about his assets, about his plans for his estate. Robert had hired a private investigator. The letter explained this matter-of-factly, without apology. "I know it seems extreme, Sarah, but I had to protect you. I had to know if my suspicions were correct or if I was just a paranoid old man seeing shadows." The investigator had followed David and Jessica for 14 months, and what he discovered was documented in the folder Sarah was now holding. Sarah had set down the letter and opened the folder, and what she'd found inside had made her feel sick and vindicated and heartbroken all at once. There were photographs, hundreds of them, date-stamped and time-stamped and organized chronologically. David and Jessica together at hotels, on David and Jessica together at Jessica's house when Marcus was traveling for work. David and Jessica together at a restaurant 2 towns over where they thought nobody would recognize them. The photographs went back 26 months, which meant the affair had been going on even longer than David had admitted. There were bank records showing David had opened secret accounts that Sarah had never known about. There were text messages, pages and pages of text messages that the investigator had somehow obtained legally through David's old phone that he'd traded in at a shop whose owner happened to be Robert's friend from the aerospace company. The shop owner had pulled the data before wiping the phone, and all of it had been given to Robert's investigator. Sarah had read through those text messages and felt her stomach turn, and they were discussing her, analyzing her, strategizing about her. David to Jessica, "She's so trusting it's almost sad. If her father kicks it soon, we should be able to get at least a decent chunk in the divorce." Jessica to David, "Keep being patient. I'll keep her close. Keep her dependent on me for emotional support. When you leave, she'll lean on me and won't suspect anything." David to Jessica, "God, I can't wait to be done with her. Just a little longer." Jessica to David, "I love you. We just have to wait for the old man to die." The messages went on, casual cruelty mixed with planning and calculation. There were discussions about exactly when to file for divorce, what David should claim, how to maximize his financial settlement. There were discussions about how to manipulate Sarah emotionally, how to keep her off balance so she wouldn't make good decisions. It was all there, documented and undeniable, a record of betrayal so thorough it took Sarah's breath away. But Robert's folder contained more than just evidence of the affair. There were financial documents showing that David had been quietly moving money out of joint accounts and into his secret accounts for over a year. Not large amounts that would trigger alerts, but small transfers, a few $100s here and there that added up to tens of thousands over time. This was financial fraud, theft from marital assets. There were emails between David and a divorce attorney dated 3 months before Robert's death, discussing strategy for filing for divorce and what David's claims to Sarah's inheritance might be. David had been planning this long before Robert died, long before there was any fortune to fight over. He'd just been planning to take whatever he could get from Sarah's modest assets and move on with Jessica. The massive inheritance had simply raised the stakes. Sarah had finished going through the folder and picked up her father's letter again. The final page said, "Sarah, I've left all of this evidence with Harold because I knew you'd need it. I've also arranged for Harold to be your attorney if you need legal representation. He's the best, and he's already been paid to represent you for as long as necessary. Use this evidence. Protect yourself. Protect the wealth I've left you, not because the money matters, but because you matter. These people tried to use you and they deserve to face consequences. I'm so sorry I can't be there to protect you myself. But I've done everything I can to make sure you have the tools to protect yourself. Trust Harold. Trust the evidence. And please, trust yourself. You are stronger than you know. You are my daughter, and you are worth more than all the money in the world. I love you, Sarah. I will always love you. Dad." Sarah had sat in Harold's office for a long time after reading that letter, crying quietly, missing her father with an intensity that was almost unbearable. But underneath the grief, there was something else growing, something that felt like steel, anger, determination, clarity. Her father had known. He'd seen what she'd missed. He'd protected her even after his death. And now she had everything she needed to fight back. When Harold had returned to the office, Sarah had looked up at him with red eyes and said, "I want to destroy them." My Harold had nodded slowly and said, "Let's talk about how we're going to do that." They'd spent the next 3 hours going over strategy. With the evidence Robert had gathered, David's claims to the inheritance would be decimated. The proof of the affair going back over 2 years, the evidence of financial fraud, the documented conspiracy between David and Jessica to manipulate Sarah and steal from her, all of it painted a picture of a man who'd entered the marriage in bad faith and had been planning to defraud his wife long before there was a fortune involved. Harold had explained that Connecticut courts took fraud and bad faith very seriously in divorce proceedings. A spouse who could be proven to have acted in bad faith, who'd stolen from marital assets, who'd engaged in extensive planning to defraud their partner, could be denied any share of assets entirely. The inheritance was already protected because Sarah had kept it separate, but with this evidence they could ensure David got nothing from the divorce, not even his share of the house or their joint savings. Beyond that, Harold said, David could face criminal charges. The financial fraud, the theft of marital assets, the conspiracy with Jessica to obtain financial information illegally by photographing private documents, all of this could be prosecuted. Sarah could choose to pursue criminal charges or simply use the threat of prosecution as leverage in the divorce. The choice was hers. Sarah had asked about Jessica, what consequences she might face. Harold had said Jessica's role was murkier legally since she wasn't married to Sarah and hadn't technically stolen anything herself. But she'd been an accomplice to David's fraud, and she'd definitely broken laws by photographing financial documents without authorization. If Sarah wanted to pursue it, Jessica could be charged with conspiracy and potentially identity theft, depending on exactly what information she'd obtained. There was also the possibility of a civil lawsuit, suing Jessica for intentional infliction of emotional distress and fraud in the inducement of friendship, though Harold admitted those cases were harder to win. The important thing was that Jessica wouldn't escape unscathed. Sarah had listened to all of this and made her decision quickly. She wanted to file for divorce immediately, wanted to present all the evidence, wanted David to know that she knew everything and had proof of everything. She wanted him to understand that he'd miscalculated badly. And yes, she wanted to pursue criminal charges. What David had done wasn't just betrayal, it was theft and fraud, and he deserved to face legal consequences. Harold had nodded and said they'd file the divorce petition by the end of the week. In the meantime, Sarah needed to secure her assets, change all her passwords and account numbers, remove David's access to anything financial. Harold's firm would handle all of that. They'd also get a restraining order preventing David from entering the house or contacting Sarah except through attorneys. Sarah had agreed to everything. And then she'd asked Harold what she should do with the evidence against Jessica. Harold had suggested that they send a letter to Jessica informing her that they had evidence of her role in the fraud and giving her two options: cooperate fully in the case against David, providing testimony and additional evidence, or face potential criminal charges herself. It was harsh, but it would likely make Jessica turn on David to save herself. Sarah had felt a grim satisfaction at that prospect and had told Harold to send the letter. The divorce proceedings began 1 week later. Sarah's petition laid out the entire case, every piece of evidence, every documented betrayal. David's attorney had read through it and immediately withdrawn from the case, telling David he couldn't represent someone with so much clear evidence of fraud against them. David had scrambled to find another lawyer, finally hiring someone who'd taken the case only after David promised to pay an enormous retainer up front. The new lawyer had filed a response denying everything, claiming the evidence was fabricated or misinterpreted, but the denials rang hollow when confronted with time-stamped photographs and bank records and David's own text messages. Meanwhile, Jessica had received Harold's letter and had called within 24 hours asking for a meeting. She'd arrived at Harold's office with her own lawyer and had immediately agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. What Jessica revealed in her cooperation sessions was even worse than what Robert's investigator had discovered. She'd confirmed that the entire friendship with Sarah had been orchestrated. And David had approached her during Sarah's first year of marriage and told her he was already unhappy, already thinking about divorce, but he needed to wait until it made financial sense. He'd asked Jessica to become friends with Sarah, to make herself indispensable, so that when the divorce happened, Sarah would have support and wouldn't become suspicious of David's motives. Jessica had agreed because she'd always been attracted to David, and she'd liked the idea of playing a long game. The friendship had been fake from day one. Every coffee date, every shopping trip, every late-night phone call where Sarah had shared her fears and dreams, all of it had been performance and information gathering. Jessica had reported everything back to David. When Sarah had confided that she was worried about her father's health, Jessica had told David. When Sarah had mentioned that her father seemed to have more money than she'd thought, Jessica had told David. They'd been waiting for Robert to die so they could move forward with their plan. The affair had started about 14 months into the friendship. David and Jessica had been working together so closely, talking so frequently about Sarah and their strategy, that attraction had grown into action. They'd been careful, meeting only when they were sure Sarah wouldn't find out, using burner phones for some of their communications. But they'd gotten sloppy eventually, confident that Sarah trusted them too much to ever suspect. The coffee meeting Sarah had walked in on 6 months before Robert's death hadn't been about planning a surprise party. And they'd been discussing whether to move up the divorce timeline because David was tired of pretending to be a devoted husband. They'd ultimately decided to wait just a bit longer to see if Robert's death might bring some inheritance that would make the wait worthwhile. They'd had no idea how worthwhile it would turn out to be. Jessica testified to all of this in a deposition that was recorded and transcribed. She described the plan in clinical detail, showed additional text messages from her own phone that Robert's investigator hadn't captured, provided dates and times and locations. Her cooperation was thorough because she was saving herself, but every word she spoke was another nail in David's legal coffin. David's attorney had tried to suppress the deposition, arguing it was coerced, but the judge had ruled it admissible. Everything was admissible because everything was true and documented. 6 months after Robert's death, the divorce case went to court for final proceedings. Sarah sat in the courtroom with Harold beside her, and across the aisle David sat with his lawyer looking diminished and cornered. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Thornton, who had a reputation for taking a hard line against fraud and deception in divorce cases. The proceedings took 2 days. Harold presented the evidence methodically, building the case piece by piece. The timeline of the affair, the financial fraud, the text messages, the photographs, Jessica's testimony. The judge had listened without expression, taking notes, asking pointed questions. David's attorney had tried to present a defense, arguing that David had loved Sarah once, that relationships deteriorate, that this was just a marriage that had ended badly and didn't deserve criminal scrutiny. But Judge Thornton had cut him off and said this wasn't just a marriage that ended badly. This was a systematic fraud that had been perpetrated over years with the specific intent to steal from the plaintiff. When it was David's turn to testify, he'd tried to appear remorseful and claim he'd made mistakes but hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Judge Thornton had asked him directly if he'd opened secret bank accounts and transferred marital funds without Sarah's knowledge. David had hesitated and then admitted he had. Judge Thornton had asked if he'd been planning to divorce Sarah before there was any inheritance. David had said yes, but only because the marriage wasn't working. Judge Thornton had asked if he'd conspired with Jessica Chen to manipulate Sarah and obtain financial information. David had tried to claim it wasn't conspiracy, they were just friends discussing things. But the judge had held up the text messages and asked if he was seriously suggesting that planning to get at least a decent chunk in the divorce didn't constitute financial motivation. The courtroom had been silent. David had no good answer. His lawyer had objected to the judge's characterization, but Judge Thornton had overruled the objection and said she'd heard enough. She'd recessed for 2 hours to review everything, and when she returned, her ruling was swift and brutal. The divorce was granted, effective immediately. David would receive nothing from the marriage, no share of the house, no share of joint savings accounts, no share of any assets. Everything would go to Sarah as compensation for the fraud perpetrated against her. Furthermore, Judge Thornton said she was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. David had committed fraud, theft, and conspiracy, and while this was a civil court, she had the obligation to report criminal activity. David's face had gone white. His attorney had tried to object again, but Judge Thornton had silenced him with a look. She'd turned to Sarah and said, "Miss Mitchell, I am deeply sorry for what you've endured. Your father's foresight in documenting this betrayal has served you well. I hope you find peace and healing." Then she'd banged her gavel and the divorce was final. Outside the courtroom, David had tried to approach Sarah, but Harold had stepped between them and David's attorney had pulled David away. Sarah had watched David walk to his car, getting in alone, driving away to a life that was now in ruins. Jessica wasn't there. She'd been banned from attending the proceedings as part of her cooperation agreement. Sarah had felt nothing watching David leave. No satisfaction, no anger, just a hollow, tired feeling like she'd been running for miles and had finally stopped. Harold had put a hand on her shoulder and asked if she was all right. Sarah had said she didn't know yet, but she would be eventually. They'd gone back to Harold's office and Sarah had signed the final paperwork, and just like that, her marriage was over and her betrayers were facing consequences. The district attorney had filed criminal charges against David 3 weeks later: fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit theft. David had pleaded not guilty and tried to fight the charges, but with all the evidence and Jessica's testimony, the case was overwhelmingly strong. 6 months later, after his legal bills had drained his savings and his career had collapsed because nobody wanted a financial advisor who'd been caught committing fraud, David had accepted a plea deal. 18 months in prison, 5 years probation, restitution to Sarah for the money he'd stolen from joint accounts. Jessica had received probation and community service as part of her cooperation agreement, and she'd moved out of state almost immediately after the sentencing. Sarah had been there in the courtroom the day David was sentenced. She'd wanted to see it, needed to see it, needed the closure of watching him be held accountable. David had looked at her once across the courtroom before he was led away in handcuffs, and Sarah had met his eyes and felt absolutely nothing. The man she'd thought she married had never existed. The man being led away to prison was a stranger who'd worn her husband's face and lied for 12 years. When it was over, Sarah had walked out of the courthouse into a bright autumn morning and had felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in months. Harold had been waiting for her outside and he'd handed her an envelope. "What's this?" Sarah had asked. Harold had smiled slightly and said it was the last thing from her father, something Robert had instructed him to give Sarah only after everything was resolved, and she'd proven she could protect herself. Sarah had opened the envelope and found a short note in her father's handwriting. "Sarah, if you're reading this, you've survived the worst of it. You've fought back. You've protected yourself and the legacy I left you. I am so incredibly proud of you, though I wish I could tell you that in person. Now comes the hardest part, figuring out what to do next, how to build a life from the ruins of the one that was destroyed. I have one piece of advice. Don't let this betrayal make you hard. Don't let it steal your ability to trust or love or believe in people. Yes, David and Jessica were terrible, but there are good people in the world too. Use the money I left you to do good things, help people, build something meaningful, and when you're ready, open your heart again. You deserve love, real love, not the counterfeit version you had. You deserve friendship, real friendship, the kind that doesn't hide knives behind smiles. It will take time to learn to trust again, but please, don't give up on humanity because two people failed you. Most people are better than that. I believe in you. I always have. Now it's time for you to believe in you too. With all my love, Dad. Sarah had read the note standing on the courthouse steps and had cried right there in public, not caring who saw. When she'd composed herself, Harold had asked what she wanted to do next. Sarah had thought about it and said she wanted to start a foundation in her father's name, something that helped people the way Robert had quietly helped people throughout his life. Harold had said he could make that happen. Over the next 6 months, Sarah had worked with attorneys and financial advisors and nonprofit experts to establish the Catherine Mitchell Foundation, named after her mother who died of cancer when Sarah was too young to remember her. The foundation focused on providing financial assistance for cancer treatment to people who couldn't afford it, paying for experimental therapies and clinical trials and medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Sarah had used $50 million of her inheritance as the initial endowment, and the foundation had begun operating by the following spring. Sarah had also moved out of the house she'd shared with David, unable to live in a space that held so many memories of lies. She'd bought a smaller place, a beautiful historic home in a quiet neighborhood, not a mansion, but comfortable and hers alone. She'd furnished it simply and hung photographs of her father in every room. She'd started therapy, working through the trauma of betrayal and the complicated grief of losing her father and discovering his secret all at once. The therapist had told her that healing wasn't linear, that she'd have good days and bad days, and that was exactly how it went. Some days Sarah felt strong and purposeful, working on the foundation, making decisions about grants and funding. Other days she felt hollowed out, unable to trust her own judgment about people, wondering if she'd ever believe anyone again. She'd joined a support group for people who'd experienced extreme betrayal in relationships, and hearing other people's stories had helped her feel less alone. Slowly, carefully, Sarah had begun to rebuild her life. She'd made new friends, though she was cautious in a way she'd never been before. She'd learned to pay attention to inconsistencies, to trust her instincts when something felt off, to value actions over words. She'd started dating after about a year. Nothing serious at first, just coffee dates and dinners, relearning how to let someone know her without immediately fearing they were after her money. She'd been honest about her wealth from the beginning with anyone she dated, figuring it was better to know early if someone was interested in her money rather than discovering it years later. Some men had disappeared after learning she was wealthy, intimidated, or put off by the imbalance. Others had become obviously interested only in her money, and Sarah had learned to spot the signs quickly. But there had been a few who seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, and with one of those men, a teacher named Michael who'd known nothing about her father's story until their 4th date, she'd begun to build something that felt real and safe. Through the foundation work, Sarah had discovered something unexpected. She'd found purpose in a way she never had in her marketing career. Meeting with grant recipients, hearing their stories, seeing how the financial assistance changed their lives, it made her father's money feel meaningful rather than just a number in an account. She'd met a single mother of 3 who'd been diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer and couldn't afford the treatment her oncologist recommended. The foundation had paid for everything, and 2 years later that mother was cancer-free and her children still had their mom. She'd met a young man, barely 25, with a rare form of leukemia who'd been told his only chance was an experimental treatment that cost $300,000 and wasn't covered by insurance. The foundation had paid for it and he'd gone into remission. And these stories, dozens and then hundreds of them, had transformed Sarah's grief and anger into something productive. She wasn't just rich, she was making a difference. Sarah had also learned more about her father's secret life through the foundation work. She'd discovered that Robert had been doing this same kind of quiet charity for decades, long before his death. He'd paid medical bills for strangers he'd read about in the newspaper. He'd funded scholarships for engineering students who couldn't afford tuition. He'd donated to cancer research foundations anonymously. The private wealth management firm that had handled his money had records of all these donations, hundreds of them over 30 years, and when Harold had shown Sarah the records, she'd cried seeing the scope of her father's generosity. He'd been living simply not because he was cheap or didn't know how to enjoy life, but because he'd been giving most of his money away to people who needed it more than he did. That was who Robert Mitchell had been underneath the modest exterior, a man who understood that wealth was a tool for helping others, not a trophy to display. 2 years after her father's death, Sarah had visited his grave on a cold February morning. She'd brought flowers and had stood there talking to him the way she used to talk to him on their Wednesday evening phone calls. She'd told him about the foundation, about the lives they were saving, about how many people had written to thank her for her father's generosity even though they'd never known his name. She'd told him about Michael, how he was kind and patient and had no interest in her money, how they were taking things slowly but it felt right. She'd told her father that she was okay, that she'd survived, that she was building a life that honored his memory and his values, and she'd thanked him, through tears, for seeing what she couldn't see, for protecting her even after his death, for teaching her that real wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character and integrity and love. Standing there at his grave, Sarah had remembered something her father had said to her years ago, long before she knew about his fortune or the betrayal that was coming. They'd been having dinner at her house, just the two of them, because David had been working late and Robert had been quiet and thoughtful. Finally, he'd said, "Sarah, I want you to remember something. The measure of a person isn't what they do when people are watching. It's what they do when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain, when integrity is the only reward." David and Jessica had failed that test completely. They'd been liars and manipulators when they thought nobody was watching. But Robert Mitchell had passed it, by living modestly and giving generously when nobody knew his name. And Sarah was determined to pass it too, to use the fortune she'd inherited to help people quietly and meaningfully, the way her father had done. That was his real legacy, not the money, but the example of how to live with integrity when you had the power to do otherwise. Sarah had left the cemetery that day feeling something she hadn't felt in 2 years: peace, not the absence of pain because the betrayal still hurt and probably always would, but peace with who she'd become through the worst experience of her life. She'd been tested in ways she never imagined, had her trust shattered and her reality destroyed, and she'd come through it stronger and clearer about what mattered. Her father had been right about everything. Money didn't change people, it revealed them. David and Jessica had been revealed as greedy and hollow, Sarah had been revealed as resilient and purposeful, and Robert Mitchell, even in death, had been revealed as the most generous and protective father a daughter could have asked for. The story could end there, with Sarah rebuilding and healing and finding peace. But there's one more piece, one final revelation that came 3 years after Robert's death. Sarah had been working late at the foundation office, reviewing grant applications, when Harold had called her cell phone. His voice had been strange, excited and uncertain at the same time, and he'd asked if she could come to his office first thing in the morning. It was important, he'd said, something about her father's estate that he'd just discovered. Sarah had agreed, curious and slightly worried, and the next morning she'd sat across from Harold's desk while he'd explained something that had taken her breath away. When Robert's estate had been probated 3 years earlier, there had been a complete accounting of all his assets. The $847 million had been accounted for in various investment accounts and holdings. But Harold had recently been contacted by a law firm in Switzerland because one of Robert's patents had finally expired after 30 years, and the company that held the licensing agreement had been required to do a final audit. During that audit, they discovered that Robert had one additional asset that had somehow been missed in the estate probate. It was an account at a Swiss bank opened 40 years ago when Robert was just 31 years old, right after Sarah's mother, Catherine, had died. On the account had been funded with an initial deposit of $50,000, money from Catherine's life insurance policy, and Robert had left instructions that it was never to be touched, just invested and left to grow. For 40 years, that account had been sitting in a Swiss bank, growing with compound interest and careful management. Nobody knew about it except Robert and the bank, and because it was held under a slightly different spelling of Robert's name and registered to an old address, it hadn't come up in the estate searches. The Swiss bank had finally tracked down the estate through the patent expiration and had informed Harold that the account existed. When Harold had asked about the balance, the bank had told him the account now contained $132 million. Sarah had stared at Harold in disbelief. Her father had hidden another fortune, this one seeded with money from her mother's death, invested for 40 years with instructions that it never be touched. Harold had asked the Swiss bank why Robert had set it up this way, and they'd sent him a letter that Robert had left with the account instructions. Harold had given Sarah the letter, and she'd opened it with shaking hands. The letter was dated 6 months before Robert died. Catherine's money, her father had written, it was never mine to spend. It was hers, and when she died, it became yours, even though you were too young to know it. I've let it grow all these years, waiting until the time was right. If you're reading this, it means you've survived whatever betrayal I feared might come. You've protected yourself. You've proven you're strong. This money is your mother's gift to you. Use it however you want. You don't have to give it to the foundation or use it to help others, though I know you probably will because that's who you are. This is just for you, from your mother who loved you and never got to see you grow up. She would be so proud of you, Sarah. I am so proud of you. Take this money and do something that makes you happy. You've earned the right to think about your own happiness. All my love, Dad. Sarah had sat in Harold's office holding that letter and thinking about the mother she couldn't remember, and the father who'd protected her across time and even across death. $132 million that was just for her, not tied to the estate or the foundation or anything else. Her mother's money, held in trust for 40 years, waiting for this moment. Sarah had asked Harold what she needed to do to access it, and Harold had said he'd handle all the paperwork with the Swiss bank. The money would be transferred to an account in Sarah's name within a few weeks. Sarah had nodded and then had sat quietly for a long time, thinking. Finally, she'd asked Harold if she could make a donation from that money before it was even transferred, and Harold had said of course. Sarah had told him to set up a second foundation, this one called the Catherine Mitchell Memorial Foundation, focused specifically on supporting children who'd lost parents to cancer. All $132 million invested to fund that mission in perpetuity. Harold had looked surprised and had asked if she was sure, if she didn't want to keep at least some of it for herself. Sarah had smiled, really smiled, and said no, this felt right. Her mother's money helping other children who'd lost parents, making sure they had the support and resources they needed. That's what Catherine would have wanted, that's what Sarah wanted, and that's where this story ends, or maybe where it really begins. Sarah Mitchell, who'd thought she'd known her father and her husband and her best friend, who'd discovered that two of those people were liars and one was a hero, who'd inherited a fortune and nearly lost it to betrayal, who'd fought back and won and used her wealth to help others. Sarah Mitchell stood in her father's lawyer's office 3 years after Robert's death and made the choice to give away another fortune in her mother's name. She left Harold's office that day and drove to the cemetery where both her parents were buried side by side. She stood between their graves and told them both about the foundation she was creating in her mother's name. She told them she'd survived the worst that greed and betrayal could do to her. She told them she'd built a life that mattered, that helped people, that honored them both. And she told them that she finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. Money reveals character, but it doesn't define it. Sarah Mitchell was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but that's not what made her valuable. What made her valuable was her resilience, her generosity, her refusal to let betrayal turn her bitter and hard. What made her valuable was her choice to use wealth as a tool for helping others rather than hoarding it or spending it on herself. What made her valuable was her ability to love again, to trust again, and to believe in people again even after two people had proven themselves unworthy of that trust. David and Jessica had tried to take everything from her: her money, her marriage, her friendship, her ability to trust. In the end, they'd taken nothing that mattered and had lost everything themselves. David had served his prison time and now lived in another state, alone, broke, working a minimum wage job because nobody would hire a financial advisor convicted of fraud. Jessica had moved to Arizona and had tried to rebuild her life, but the story of her betrayal had followed her, and she'd found that real friends are hard to come by when you've proven yourself capable of such a calculated deception. Sarah thought about them sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to pity. They'd had a chance to be part of something good, and to share a life with someone who would have been loyal and generous and loving forever. They'd thrown that away for money they never got, and in doing so, they'd revealed exactly who they were. Sarah was grateful for that revelation, painful as it had been because it had cleared the path for her real life to begin. The life she was living now, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was, doing work that mattered, honoring her parents' memory, building something meaningful. This was the life Robert Mitchell had hoped she'd have when he hid his fortune and wrote those letters and hired those investigators. This was the life Catherine Mitchell would have wanted for her daughter if she'd lived to see her grow up. And this was the life Sarah had chosen for herself, built from the ruins of betrayal, a stronger and more purposeful than anything she could have imagined back when she was just a marketing manager in a modest colonial house, thinking her biggest concern was what to make for Thursday dinner. Sarah's story is about betrayal, yes, but it's also about survival and transformation, and the enduring power of a parent's love reaching across death to protect a child. It's about the difference between the wealth you have and the wealth you give away. It's about learning that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but will never be quite the same, and that's okay because caution and wisdom aren't the same as bitterness. Most of all, it's about the truth that character is revealed in how we respond to our worst moments. David and Jessica responded to their worst impulses by lying and scheming and betraying, as Sarah responded to her worst moment by fighting back, protecting herself, and then choosing generosity over vindictiveness. And Robert Mitchell, seeing betrayal coming before it arrived, responded by building a fortress of evidence and love around his daughter so she wouldn't have to face it alone. So what do you think? If you suddenly inherited a fortune tomorrow, do you think the people closest to you would change? Would they be revealed to be exactly who you always thought they were? Or would you discover, as Sarah did, that you'd been living with strangers wearing familiar faces? And here's an even harder question. If you're completely honest with yourself, what would sudden wealth reveal about you? Would you use it to help others, or would you hoard it? Would you stay humble, or would you let it change who you are? These aren't easy questions, and there are no simple answers, but they're worth thinking about because character is something we all like to think we have until it's tested. Sarah Mitchell's character was tested in the worst way possible, and she passed that test. Could you say the same? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever experienced a betrayal that changed everything, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing after someone you trusted destroyed it, share your story. This is a community where truth matters and where survivors support survivors. If this story affected you, if Sarah's journey from devastating betrayal to purposeful healing resonated with you, hit that like button so we know to bring you more real stories about real people navigating the messiest parts of human nature. And subscribe to this channel because next week we're telling you about a woman who discovered her husband had been living a double life with two separate families just 15 miles apart. How did he maintain two marriages, two sets of children, two complete lives for 12 years without either family knowing And what happened when a medical emergency brought both families to the same hospital room at the same time? That story is even more unbelievable than this one, and every word of it is true. Until then, remember what Robert Mitchell taught his daughter and what Sarah learned the hard way. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. The question is, what would it reveal about you? Thanks for watching.